Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in New Orleans history. Please leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are listening to this narration before we start. We want to know where and when these documented stories get to. In the hot summer of 1838, when New Orleans was a mix of French, Spanish, and American cultures, a promise was made on Burgundy Street that would last for generations. The disappearance of Nathaniel Budrow, a well-respected cotton merchant, and Adeline Harper, a woman who had just been freed, shook up the city's strict social order. At first, people were just talking about it in the Garden District, but it got much worse when investigators found an abandoned carriage at the edge of Bayou Street John. The seats were stained with what looked like ink, or something even darker. Nathaniel Budrow bought Adeline Harper's freedom just 3 days before they both disappeared, according to parish records found during a courthouse renovation in 1962. The paper was yellowed and had water damage. It had both of their signatures and the seal of a notary public named James Wilson, who later said he had never met either of them. This contradiction was just the first thread in a tapestry of half-truths and silence that would cover the case for more than 100 years. The Budrow family mansion is still on Prytania Street, but it has changed hands many times since 1838. Local historians say that no owner has stayed for more than 7 years. Records from the time show that the property was worth much more than what it was selling for on the market, but it kept selling for less. People who used to live there told the Times-Picayune in 1968 that there was a heavy stillness that seemed to settle over some rooms, especially the library and what used to be the master bedroom on the second floor. Before the events of August 1838, the Budrow family had a lot of power in New Orleans society. Nathaniel was the oldest son of a French immigrant who made a lot of money in the cotton trade. He was 42 years old. Letters and other business documents kept at the Williams Research Center show that the family had ties to Paris, London, and New York. The Budrow name came up a lot in social announcements. Their parties were known for being over the top, even in a city known for its excesses. Most of what we know about Adeline Harper comes from bills of sale and one diary entry written by Nathaniel's mother, Elizabeth Budrow. The entry from the 12th of April, 1837, talks about the girl with the strange eyes who had been bought from a plantation in Street Bernard Parish. Elizabeth said that her son had paid too much for Adeline, who was said to be literate and good at running a household. The diary doesn't say anything else about her, but the household accounts show that they spent more on fabrics and a modist in the months before she went missing. In the 1832, the social circles of New Orleans were very strict, with clear lines between white society, free people of color, and enslaved people. Dr. Margaret Calloway, a historian, says that relationships that crossed these lines were not uncommon, but they were kept in the shadows. Her 1961 book, Whispers from the Quarter, is still one of the most thorough studies of the time. People talked about them in quiet voices behind closed doors and gave each other knowing looks at social events, but they never talked about them out loud. Even for Louisiana, the summer of 1838 was very hot. Reports from July said that the streets were almost empty during the day, and most business was done in the cool of the early morning or after sunset. Nathaniel Budrow started to pull back from his usual social activities in this oppressive environment. People turned down invitations and put off business meetings. Letters between Elizabeth Budrow and her sister in Baltimore, which were found during the 1958 renovation of the family crypt, show that Nathaniel had become secretive and distracted, spending hours at a time locked up in his study. Adeline Harper's status changed during this time. The manumission papers filed on the 10th of August, 1838, gave Adeline Harper ownership of one female slave, Adeline, approximately 23 years of age. Nathaniel and Adeline both signed the document. Adeline's signature was surprisingly neat for someone who had never had formal schooling. 3 days later, Nathaniel and Adeline both went missing. The first investigation was only done as a formality. Police reports kept in the city's records show that Elizabeth Budrow reported her son missing on August 16, 3 days after he didn't show up for a business meeting. There is no mention of Adeline Harper in the report. Later, when asked, Elizabeth would say that she didn't know about the woman's manumission or her son's apparent plans. Lieutenant Robert Murphy, the officer in charge of the investigation, said that the family seemed more interested in keeping things quiet than finding out what happened. The abandoned carriage found near Bayou Street John on August 20th was the first real proof that something more than a scandalous elopement may have happened. The car's unique crest showed that it belonged to the Budrow family. Inside, investigators found a man's hat, which they thought belonged to Nathaniel, and a small suitcase with women's clothes in it. The most troubling thing was the dark stain on the upholstery, which was first thought to be ink, but was later changed in the report to substance of unknown origin. There was no further forensic examination recorded. If it weren't for a letter found in 1959 while an old boarding house on Rampart Street was being torn down, the case might have been completely forgotten. The letter was written carefully on expensive paper and addressed to "My dearest A." It was signed N. The letter talked about a plan to leave for France, where they could live as husband and wife without the restrictions of society. The letter was written on the 12th of August, 1838, the day before the person went missing. There was an interesting postscript at the end. "Beware the one who watches from the shadows. He has made his intentions clear." This mention of an unknown third party changed the story from one of forbidden love to something that could be more dangerous. Later, in 1963, amateur historian William Crawford found business letters that suggested Nathaniel Budrow had been in a fight with some well-known merchants in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Crawford's notes, which were published after his death in 1967, say that the disagreement was mostly about shipping routes and claims of price manipulation. Merchant Thomas Reynolds wrote one letter that could be seen as a veiled threat. "Your recent decisions show a worrying lack of judgment. One might wonder what other parts of your life are also suffering from this." The Reynolds family was one of the oldest and most powerful in New Orleans. Their house on Esplanade Avenue was not far from the Budrow home, and social records show that the two families were friends. A society column in the Picayune from January 1838 said that Thomas Reynolds' daughter Caroline was supposed to marry Mr. Budrow, who was single, by the end of the year. There was never an official announcement of an engagement. For decades, no one looked into the links between the Reynolds family and the disappearances. In 1957, a graduate student named James Landry found accounting ledgers belonging to the Reynolds Shipping Company while doing research for his dissertation on business practices before the Civil War. Payments to people whose names were only given by initials were hidden among routine entries. Landry thought the notes were coordinates along the Mississippi River. One entry from the 14th of August, 1838, read, "J.M., final payment, package secured." Landry's study was never made public. University records show that he gave up on his dissertation in 1958 after what his co-workers called a paranoia episode. He left New Orleans without warning, telling his academic advisor that he felt like he was always being watched. No one knew where he was until a short obituary in a Minneapolis newspaper in 1966 said that Landry had had mental health problems since he left Louisiana. The JM in the ledger could have been James Monroe, who was known in New Orleans police records as a man with special talents who was sometimes hired by rich families when regular methods didn't work. Monroe's name came up in a lot of investigations in the 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds, but he was never officially charged with a crime. Census records show that he lived on Dauphine Street, which is less than half a mile from both the Budrow and Reynolds homes. There is still a lot of guesswork about what happened on the night of the 13th of August, 1838. The carriage was found about 7 miles from the city center, in a place that would have been very isolated and full of trees at the time. Police reports say that a search of the nearby swampland and waterways never found any bodies. Lieutenant Murphy said, "Further expenditure of resources seems unwarranted given the circumstances, and the search was called off after 5 days." The report's delicate wording likely referred to the case's social issues. A well-known white businessman going missing with a woman who had just been freed from slavery was so scandalous that it needed to be kept quiet. If, as the evidence suggests, there were financial and social ties to other powerful families, the desire to quietly end the investigation would have been even stronger. Elizabeth Boudreau paid for a memorial stone in Street Louis Cemetery No. 1 in 1841. The simple marker only has Nathaniel's name and the dates of his birth and death, even though no remains were buried there. The family never publicly talked about what happened to Adeline Harper. Over the next 10 years, the Boudreau business interests were slowly sold off, and Elizabeth eventually went back to live with her family in Baltimore. She passed away there in 1853, leaving behind a sealed letter to her dead son. The Maryland Historical Society still has this letter in its collection. It wasn't until 1960 that the contents of this letter were made public. That year, researcher Catherine Martin was given access to it as part of a larger study on family letters from before the Civil War. Martin's notes say that Elizabeth wrote about how sorry she was for acting too quickly and out of misguided concern for our family's position. She asked for forgiveness for letting fear get in the way of maternal love and for listening to those who claim to have our interests at heart. Most importantly, she wrote, "I know now that the darkness that descended that night was of our own making, not yours." This indirect reference implies that Elizabeth might have been aware of, or possibly even engaged in, the circumstances surrounding her son and Adeline Harper. The darkness she talked about could have been a metaphor for the family's loss of social status after the scandal. But when looked at with the other evidence, it makes a more literal interpretation seem more likely. Local folklore has kept alive a part of the story that isn't in official records. Anthropologist Marie Devarro collected stories in 1955 that said people living near Bayou Street. John talked about restless spirits near the place where the carriage was found. One story came from an old woman whose grandmother lived nearby in the 1832nd. It was about a lady in white who walks among the cypress trees, looking for something she will never find. Another person talked about the sound of carriage wheels on nights when the moon is new, going down a road that isn't there anymore. Devarro said that these kinds of stories are common in a city like New Orleans that is full of history. He said that they should be seen as cultural artifacts instead of historical evidence. Still, they show how the community's memory of Nathaniel Boudreau and Adeline Harper's disappearance changed over time, from a scandal to a legend. In 1959, workers who were getting ready to build a new road near the original Bayou site found what they called a collection of personal effects buried about 3 feet below the surface. There was a pocket watch with the initials NB on the case, a few coins from the 1832nd, and pieces of what looked like a woman's hair comb. It was about 50 yards from where the carriage had been found over 100 years before. The discovery sparked a short-lived interest in the case. The Times-Picayune published an article called "Century-Old Mystery Resurfaces," which gave a brief overview of what was known and what might have happened. The artifacts were taken to the Louisiana State Museum, where they were kept in storage and mostly forgotten about, until historian Robert Bell asked to see them in 1967 for research for his book, Silenced Narratives: Lost Voices of the Antebellum South. Bell's close look at the pocket watch showed that there was an inscription inside the case that hadn't been noted in the original inventory. To NB, may time be kind to our future. Age. The message was very personal, and the gift seemed to be very expensive, which made it seem like Nathaniel and Adeline had a relationship that went beyond the usual limits of their positions in New Orleans society. Bell did more research and found a detail in the manumission papers that had been missed before. The document not only set Adeline free, but it also gave her ownership of a small piece of land on the edge of the city. Tax records from 1838 show that Nathaniel Boudreau bought the property 6 months earlier. It was a small house on a few acres of land along what is now Gentilly Boulevard, but it was far outside the city limits at the time. This clause indicates a degree of planning and foresight that contradicts the notion of a hasty elopement. Nathaniel seems to have been carefully setting things up so that Adeline could be an independent woman who could support herself financially. During this time in New Orleans, these kinds of deals weren't new, but they were usually done more quietly, often through middlemen instead of directly transferring property. A collection of letters found in the attic of a house being renovated in the Marigny district in 1962 provided the most compelling evidence about what happened to Nathaniel and Adeline. The letters, which were written by someone who only called herself A and sent to someone who called her dearest sister, talked about life in a small town outside of Boston, where the writer and her unnamed friend had moved, after leaving New Orleans for reasons too painful to commit to paper. The letters allude to their past life without being too direct. They talk about the necessity of our sudden departure and those who would prevent our happiness at any cost. One passage from December 1838 says, N. suffers from the injury he got during our journey, but the doctor says that with time and proper care, he will regain much of his former strength. I thank Providence every day that we escaped with our lives, though the price was dear. Historians have argued about whether these letters are real or not. The handwriting looks a lot like the signature on Adeline's manumission papers, but without more examples to compare, it's impossible to say for sure who wrote it. The Historic New Orleans Collection looked at the paper and ink in 1964 and found that they were the same as what was available in the late 1832. These letters, if real, show that Nathaniel and Adeline made it through whatever fight happened near Bayou Street John, but not without getting hurt. It seems they made it to the northern states, where their relationship would have been less limited by the strict racial hierarchies of the South before the Civil War. The letters don't say anything about marriage, but they do talk about living together, with phrases like our home and our small garden and plans for the future. We still don't know who the dearest sister is. There are no records that show how Adeline Harper's family was connected to her, but it was common for enslaved people to keep in touch with their families even when they were sold or inherited. It is possible, though not confirmed, that she had a sister who was already free and living in the North. The last letter in the collection, dated July 23, 1839, talks about rumors that have reached us from Louisiana that the writer is worried about. They say they are thinking about moving again, maybe to Canada, where we might find greater security in the knowledge that certain legal claims would hold no weight. This shows that Nathaniel and Adeline were still afraid of being found or facing legal trouble almost a year after they went missing. No more letters have been found, and the historical record doesn't say what happened to them. There are no census records from Massachusetts or nearby states in 1840 that can be definitely linked to Nathaniel Budrow or Adeline Harper using those names or any known aliases. The story could have ended there, with it being an unusual but ultimately inconclusive case that was pushed to the edges of history. But in 1965, when workers were digging for a new building near Porter Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they found something that changed everything. Workers found a small family cemetery that had been paved over in the late 1800s. There was a grave with a simple stone that had the initials AB and NB on it, as well as the dates 1815 to 1872 and 1796 to 1869, respectively. City records show that the Brown family owned the plot. They ran a small printing business in Cambridge from 1840 to 1880. Tax records say that Nathan Brown and his wife Abigail started the business. They were called Recently Arrived from the South. A daguerreotype photo from around 1855, found in the Cambridge Historical Society's archives, shows an old man with a walking stick sitting next to a woman whose features suggest mixed racial ancestry, but the quality of the photo makes it impossible to be sure who they are. If Nathan and Abigail Brown were really Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper living under false names, they were able to start a new life far away from the rules of New Orleans society. The printing business seems to have done okay, and records show that they were involved in local abolitionist activities, making small but regular donations to anti-slavery publications and causes. At a literary society meeting, she writes about seeing a face from the past and how they both recognized each other and decided not to say anything. She goes on to say, "Some ghosts are best left alone, especially when they have found peace in their haunting. This chance meeting, if it was really with the former Adeline Harper, shows that the fears expressed in the last letter from 1839 eventually went away enough for the couple to live a public life in Massachusetts, though they were careful about it." One of the most interesting things is an entry in Caroline Reynolds's diary from October 1857, when she was visiting Boston. She was the daughter of Thomas Reynolds. It also means that no matter what part the Reynolds family may have played in the events of 1838, Caroline had at least come to terms with what happened by 1857. The graves in Cambridge were moved during the 1965 construction project. The bodies were reburied in Mount Auburn Cemetery, and the original marker was kept. A small ceremony was held at the gravesite in 1968, the 130th anniversary of the disappearance. Most of the people there were historians and researchers who had looked into the case. Dr. Eliza Johnson was one of them. She is a direct descendant of James Wilson, the notary who signed Adeline's manumission papers. Dr. Johnson said that family tradition said that her ancestor had processed the papers even though he publicly denied it. Wilson is said to have told his daughter in secret, and then passed on to later generations, that Nathaniel Budrow had come to see him late at night and was clearly upset. He demanded that the papers be finished right away and without the usual witnesses. Wilson had done what he was told, sensing the urgency even if he didn't know why, but he found out days later that the couple had gone missing. He denied it out of fear of being linked to the scandal and possible legal problems. In 1969, the Budrow mansion on Prytania Street changed hands again. This time, it was bought by a historical preservation society that made it look like it did before the Civil War. Tour guides now talk about the disappearance of Nathaniel and Adeline as part of the house's interesting history. However, the story they tell is more about romantic elopement than the darker possibilities that the evidence suggests. Urban growth has taken over the area where the carriage used to be, near Bayou Street, John, making it hard to find the exact spot now. People in the area still sometimes hear strange sounds on very quiet nights, like the distant sound of wheels clattering or the soft splash of something hitting the water. People in New Orleans love stories like these, even if they aren't true. There is no doubt that two people disappeared from a society that would not accept their relationship in the summer of 1838. The evidence indicates they may have endured to establish a life elsewhere, albeit with considerable struggle and sacrifice. Their story, which was put together from bits and pieces over more than 100 years, shows how cruel and brave people can be, as well as how violent and strong they can be. Mount Auburn Cemetery's graves only have initials on them. There is still disagreement among historians about who they really were. Maybe that lack of clarity is appropriate, since it was the last act of privacy for two people who tried, against all odds, to decide their own fate in a world that wouldn't let them do so. The silence that surrounds much of their story is not empty. It is full of the choices they didn't make, the costs they paid, and the promises they kept, even when everything was against them. We know a lot about Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper, but there is a lot more that we don't know. The records are missing, and the witnesses are long gone. What remains is the outline of a story that makes us rethink what we know about the past, and makes us think about all the other stories that never made it into the archives. These are the lives lived in the margins and shadows, looking for freedom in a world full of rules. Robert Bell's 1968 book Silenced Narratives, which came out just a few months before his death, has perhaps the most powerful statement on the case. History is not just what is documented, but also what is purposely left undocumented. Not just what is said, but what is carefully left unsaid. In the spaces between official records, in contradictions and convenient omissions, we see the true complexity of the past and recognize how often the most human stories are those that are considered too dangerous to tell. The Louisiana State Museum still has the pocket watch that was found near Bayou Street, John, which has a hidden message on it. People who want to see it sometimes hear that it isn't on display right now or that it has been taken down for conservation. Some staff members, speaking off the record, say that the watch has a strange habit of stopping exactly 13 minutes after 10, no matter how recently it has been wound. It is still unclear whether this is a mechanical failure, a coincidence, or something else that is harder to explain. On the 13th of August, 1838, a carriage went down the dark road next to Bayou Street, John. What happened there has been passed down through the years, changing from scandal to mystery to legend. The truth is hidden in small pieces. A pocket watch, a few letters, and a grave that doesn't have a name on it. Some doors that were once closed stay closed for reasons that last longer than the people who closed them. Some promises that were once made stay true long after the people who made them have turned to dust. In 1963, an old woman named Martha Collins called the Louisiana Historical Society with an interesting story. Family records that have been passed down through the years say that her great-great-grandmother worked as a housekeeper for the Reynolds family in the late 1832. Sarah Jenkins was the name of the woman who was said to have seen a heated fight between Thomas Reynolds and Nathaniel Budrow just days before she went missing. Collins sent in several pages from what looked like a personal journal in which Sarah wrote about hearing Reynolds threaten Budrow about the impropriety of certain attachments and the consequences of pursuing such a ruinous. Of course, some historians have questioned the authenticity of these journal pages, especially since they came to light more than a century after the events they describe. Handwriting analysis done in 1964 didn't give a clear answer, but the paper was similar to materials from the 19th century. The story fits with other evidence that the Reynolds family had both personal and professional problems with Nathaniel Budrow in the months before he went missing, whether it is true or not. It is beyond a doubt that Thomas Reynolds Shipping Company grew a lot in late 1838 and 1839, taking over several routes and contracts that Budrow interests had previously controlled. Business records from the time show that Reynolds bought Budrow's company's remaining shares for prices much lower than the market value. Elizabeth Boudreau, who was in charge of her son's estate, approved the deals. Some researchers think that the timing of these purchases, which happened so soon after Nathaniel went missing, shows that they were at least opportunistic. Edward Lambert, an architectural historian, found a previously unknown room in the Budrow Mansion on Prytania Street while researching antebellum homes in New Orleans in 1966. When Lambert looked at the building's original floor plans, he found that the dimensions of the second floor were not consistent. A careful measurement showed that there was only a small space between the master bedroom and the sitting room next to it. This space could only be reached through a hidden door in what had been Nathaniel's private study. There were no windows in this secret room, which was about 6 feet by 8 feet. It looked like it had been sealed off sometime in the late 1800s. Lambert only found an empty shelf and what looked like the remains of a small desk or writing table inside. The walls showed signs of what he called extensive water damage, but the rooms around them did not show any signs of similar damage. Lambert's report, which he sent to the Historic New Orleans Collection, says that the room may have been a safe place to keep business papers or valuables. Some historians, on the other hand, have suggested a different theory based on Nathaniel's relationship with Adeline, that the room may have been used for secret meetings or as a place for Adeline to stay temporarily when she couldn't be in the main house because it would have raised questions. In 1967, when restoration work was done on the mansion, a small cache of items was found behind a loose brick in the wall of the hidden room. This gave more weight to the theory. There was a silver locket with a lock of dark hair in it, a small notebook full of what looked like poetry written by a woman, and a carefully folded piece of paper that fell apart when it was exposed to air. The partial text on the document made it look like it could have been a passenger list or booking confirmation for a ship. The notebook didn't say who wrote it, but some poems talked about eyes the color of the Mississippi in winter and hands that built empires yet tremble at my touch. One entry, dated June 4, 1838, said, 2 months until freedom comes on paper, what has long existed in heart, then the journey begins, across water to shores, where we might simply be. This timeline matches up with Adeline's manumission in early August and her later disappearance, which suggests that they had planned to leave a long time ago. The hidden room and its contents make me wonder about what Nathaniel and Adeline's relationship was like before she was freed. It implies that they were close and had made plans that went beyond just deciding to run away together. The fact that these things stayed hidden in the house instead of being taken with them may mean that their last departure was more rushed or happened under different circumstances than they had planned. Rebecca Martin, a graduate student in American literature, made an important discovery while looking into 19th century abolitionist publications in October 1968. She found a short story called The Promise in an obscure Boston literary journal called The Liberty Bell, which was published in 1842. The story is about a couple who are being chased by men hired by the woman's former owner as they leave New Orleans in the dark. The made-up couple finally finds safety in Massachusetts, where they live under fake names. The man never fully heals from his injuries, and the woman is haunted by the thought that blood was the price of our beginning. The story ends with the couple visiting the grave of their pursuers, where flowers now bloom over old hatreds. The story is told as fiction, but some parts of it are so similar to what we know about the Boudreaux Harper case that many experts think it might be a thinly veiled account of what really happened. In the story, the couple is stopped near a bayou, which leads to a violent fight that leaves the man badly hurt and one of their pursuers dead. The description of the bayou setting, the man's injuries, a gunshot wound to the leg that leaves him permanently lame, and the references to the cotton trade all point to autobiographical elements. If A.B. was really Adeline writing as Abigail Brown, this story gives the most detailed account of what might have happened on the 13th of August, 1838. It implies that the couple was attacked while trying to get away, which caused violence that left them with both physical and mental scars. The mention of visiting the grave of their pursuers is still a mystery, because there are no records of any Reynolds family members or friends being buried in Massachusetts. The Liberty Bell was an annual journal that raised money for the anti-slavery movement. It included articles by both professional and amateur writers. Wendell Phillips and Maria Weston Chapman were two well-known abolitionists whose works were included in the 1842 edition. The fact that The Promise was included shows that by that time, A.B. had made at least some friends in Boston's abolitionist circles. Martin's further investigation revealed more articles that may have been written by the same person in reform-minded magazines from the 1,840 seconds and 1,850 seconds. These essays were about the moral duty of the abolitionist cause, the education of freed slaves, and, interestingly, the need for the law to recognize marriages between people of different races. This last essay, which came out in 1849, said that love, once awakened, recognizes no boundaries of color or condition, and the laws that would constrain it are an affront to both nature and God. According to business records and printer's marks from the time, Nathan and Abigail Brown owned a printing business in Cambridge that made some of these publications. The small business seems to have focused on literature that promoted reform, which suggests that Nathaniel and Adeline stayed committed to the cause of abolition and racial equality even after they changed their names to the Browns. They did this by keeping a low profile to protect their own safety. In the 1,960 seconds, historians and civil rights activists became interested in the gravesite in Mount Auburn Cemetery. During the height of the civil rights movement in 1968, a small bronze plaque was added next to the original stone marker. It read, "Here may lie Nathaniel Boudreaux and Adeline Harper, whose quest for love and freedom defied the boundaries of their time." Their story reminds us that the struggle for human dignity has many unsung heroes. The conditional language acknowledges the ongoing historical uncertainty while honoring the symbolic importance of their story. That same year, historian Caroline Jefferson looked through all the records for the city of Cambridge from 1840 to 1872, the year Abigail Brown died, according to the grave marker. She learned that the Browns bought their house on Magazine Street in 1842 after renting rooms above their print shop. Tax records show that the business was doing well, but not very well, and by 1850 it had grown to include a small bookstore. The most important thing Jefferson found was Abigail Brown's death certificate, which was dated the 17th of April, 1872. Her age was noted as about 57 years old, which is in line with the estimated birth year of Adeline Harper. The cause of death was listed as consumption tuberculosis. The paper only said that she was born in Louisiana and was signed by Dr. William Harrison, a doctor who was known to have helped many people in Cambridge's small black community. Nathan Brown's death certificate from 1869 said that complications from long-standing injury to the lower extremity were to blame for his death, with pneumonia being the immediate cause. The document said he was born in New Orleans and worked as a printer and bookseller. Abigail Brown, who was identified as his wife, and James Brown, who was described as his son, signed it. Researchers had never heard of this son before. so his existence opened up new areas of research. Jefferson's research showed that James Brown, who was born around 1844 according to census records, went to Oberlin College in Ohio, which was one of the few colleges at the time that accepted black students. He went back to Cambridge later, where he worked in the family printing business and was involved in local politics during Reconstruction. If James was really Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper's son, then his birth in 1844 means that the couple had settled into their new lives well enough to start a family a few years after they fled New Orleans. The 1,850 census records say that James was mulatto, which suggests that Abigail's mixed-race background was known, at least to the people who took the census, rather than being hidden completely. Until 1969, when Jefferson found a newspaper notice from 1874 saying that James Brown had moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the Freedmen's Bureau, it was unclear what would happen to him after his parents died. Later records show that he married a school teacher named Sarah Williams in 1876 and had 3 kids with her. His descendants lived in the Washington area into the 20th century, not knowing that they might be related to the Budrow Harper story. Dr. Robert Bell got an anonymous package with a small leather-bound book in it in 1967. His book, Silenced Narratives, had brought new attention to the case. The book looked like a personal diary that covered the years 1838 to 1842. The pages were brittle because they were so old. The entries were written in a neat hand and told the story of N and A's early years in Massachusetts after they escaped from New Orleans. These records show that the couple first lived in Salem, Massachusetts, before moving to Cambridge in 1840 to start the printing business. The writer, who is probably Nathaniel or Nathan, said that he was still in pain from a gunshot wound to his right leg and that he sometimes had nightmares about what happened at the bayou. He said he wrote to A's sister in Philadelphia on a regular basis. She seemed to be the go-between for getting news from New Orleans. An entry from July 1839 talked about how they felt when they heard about R's sudden death. It said, "Though one cannot rejoice in another's death, there is undeniable relief in knowing that particular shadow no longer darkens our path." This could be about Thomas Reynolds, who died suddenly in June 1839 from what was called apoplexy, which was probably a stroke, according to New Orleans obituary records. The diary also talked about a growing group of trusted friends in abolitionist circles. However, it said that even among those who were committed to the cause, our particular circumstances required discretion. Several entries talked about visits from William Lloyd Garrison, a well-known abolitionist publisher who apparently gave them advice on how to grow their printing business to serve reform-minded publications. The diary most movingly recorded the couple's reactions to the birth of their son in February 1844. The entry, which was longer and more emotional than most, talked about the event as the end of a promise made years ago by moonlit waters, when we promised that whatever life we might forge would be truly free, not just for ourselves, but for any who might come after. Today, holding him in my arms, I know that every risk was justified, every sacrifice worthwhile. Historians have argued about whether or not this diary is real, especially since they don't know who sent it. In his last interview before he died in 1968, Bell said he thought the diary was real because it had details that matched up with facts about the Brown family's life in Massachusetts that had been checked out by other sources. He thought that the diary might have been kept by James Brown's descendants, who had just learned how important it was but didn't want to be known because of the complicated history of race it represented. The New Orleans City Council talked about changing the name of a small park near Bayou Street John in 1968 to honor Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper. The city's first black councilman brought up the idea, which led to a lot of debate. People who were against it said that the historical identification was still unclear and that honoring an interracial relationship from before the Civil War might be seen as divisive instead of unifying. Supporters said that the story, whether it was completely true or partly made up, was about important ideas like bravery and standing up to unfair social rules. The compromise solution was to put up a simple stone bench near where the carriage was found. It had the words, "In remembrance of all those whose stories of love and courage remain untold," written on it. On the 131st anniversary of the disappearance, the 13th of August 1969, a small ceremony dedicated the bench. Clara Williams, an old woman who was there for the dedication, was identified in newspaper articles as a great-granddaughter of James Brown of Cambridge. Williams, who was in her 72nd at the time, had come all the way from Washington just for the ceremony. In a short statement to the Times-Picayune, she said that stories of ancestors who had to leave the South under difficult circumstances had been passed down through her family for a long time. However, historians like Jefferson and Bell had only recently found specific links to the Budrow Harper story. Williams talked about how she found letters and pictures in her grandmother's things after she died in 1953. These were things that had been carefully kept, but were rarely talked about. There was a daguerreotype of Nathan and Abigail Brown, believed to be from their later years, and a letter from Abigail to her son James, written shortly before she died, in which she thought about her life. The letter, which was later given to the Historic New Orleans Collection, is what many people think is the most direct proof that Abigail Brown was the former Adeline Harper. She wrote, "The name I have lived under for so many years was not the one given to me at birth, nor the one under which I first knew both bondage and its ending. It became truly mine through choice rather than imposition, and in that lies a freedom more profound than mere legal status." She went on, "What happened that night by the water's edge changed us both in ways beyond the physical scars your father carried to his grave. I have never spoken of it fully, not even to you, my son. Some memories are best left undisturbed, like the still waters of the bayou that witness much but reveal little. Know only that the life we built here, the family we created, grew from soil watered with both blood and tears, and that its flowering has been the redemption of all that came before." The letter ends with a request that her wedding ring be buried with her after her death, returning to the earth the symbol of a promise that defied a world arranged to prevent it. When Abigail Brown was buried next to her husband in 1872, her son followed through on her request, according to cemetery records. As part of the ongoing restoration of the Budrow Mansion, workers found a small hole behind the fireplace in Nathaniel's study in 1969. There was a small painting of a young woman inside. Her features made it look like she was of mixed race. There was no signature or identification on the ivory portrait, which was made in the style that was popular in the 1830 seconds. Art historians who looked at the piece said it was very well done and thought it was worth a lot of money. They thought it had been commissioned from one of the best portraitists in New Orleans at the time. The woman in the picture is wearing a plain blue dress with a white collar. Her dark hair is styled in a way that was popular at the time. Her eyes are the most striking feature. One historian said they gave off a sense of quiet determination beneath their calm surface. The painting is now in the Historic New Orleans Collection and is labeled Unknown Woman C 1837. Many people who see it, though, think it is a picture of Adeline Harper. The narrative of Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper, assembled from disparate fragments spanning over a century, is still unfinished. We can't be sure about history, especially when we look at people who lived in opposition to the norms of their time. The available evidence indicates that they may have achieved their objective of cohabitation, albeit at a significant expense. Their journey from the strict rules of antebellum New Orleans to the relative freedom of Massachusetts is not only a physical distance traveled, but also a crossing of the boundaries that their society had set as unbreakable. In the years after the Civil War and Reconstruction, when Jim Crow laws and renewed segregation made the promise of racial equality less likely, the story of Nathaniel and Adeline could have shown a different way forward if it hadn't been buried under layers of silence and deliberate forgetting. It came back in the middle of the 20th century, when people were fighting for civil rights and racial justice again. This shows that there are many ways to resist oppressive systems, some of which are dramatic and public, while others are private and hidden. If the Browns of Cambridge were really Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper, they lived a life that showed the values of freedom and equality in both their personal and political lives. Their printing business helped the abolitionist movement, which wanted to end the system they had fled. Their son got an education and chances that would have been impossible for him in the South. Their marriage, which may never have been fully acknowledged in public, seems to have lasted more than 30 years, thanks to their dedication to each other in the face of huge problems. The pocket watch found near Bayou Street John, with its hidden message promising a future that time might treat kindly, is still one of the few things that connects us to their story. Everyone who hears their story must decide for themselves whether that promise was kept. It seems clear that Nathaniel and Adeline chose to make their own way in a world that wanted to deny their humanity and connection, no matter what the cost. Robert Bell, a historian, said in his last public lecture before he died that history is not just a record of what happened, but a conversation about what matters. The story of Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper matters because it reminds us that behind the broad strokes of historical narrative slavery, abolition, Civil War, Reconstruction lie countless individual lives, each with its own complex negotiation of constraint and possibility, courage and compromise, love and loss. On that August night in 1838, the carriage that went along Bayou Street John had two people in it who were determined to make a future that was different from what their society had planned for them. What happened on that trip changed not only their lives, but also how we think about the past they lived in. Their story, which has been hidden for more than 100 years, makes us think about how many other stories are still untold, and how many other lives don't fit into the categories and ideas that shape our view of history. In the end, maybe the most important thing about their legacy is not what we know, but what we wonder about the past, about how people can be both cruel and brave, and about how promises made against all odds can last.